My name is Celeste Ward, and I used to think skyscrapers were beautiful because they touched the clouds. Now I know they're beautiful because they hide everything beneath them. The first time I walked into Ward Holdings after my father's death, the lobby lights reflected like small suns off the marble floor. Everything gleamed, everything whispered of him. My heels echoed through the atrium, steady and sharp, the only sound that dared exist in that kind of silence. There were portraits of him everywhere, one behind the reception desk, another outside the boardroom. Silver frames. His favorite navy suit. The founder who built an empire from nothing. The man who made Ward synonymous with power. People looked at me differently now. I could feel it. Their glances lingered, sympathy laced with curiosity. The daughter of Richard Ward. The one who wasn't mentioned in the press release. I'd spent my life inside those walls but never once been seen. I was always the quiet observer, the girl with the notebooks and the polite smile, shadowing meetings I wasn't invited to. The one who poured her thoughts into designs my father never had time to read. He used to say, "There's no room for sentiment in business, Celeste." But there was a softness in his tone, a contradiction he could never quite erase. Liam never had that softness. My brother was everything a father could want on paper. Confident, commanding, fluent in power. He'd been sitting in on board meetings since he was 17, shaking hands with men twice his age and twice his ego. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was right, but because he was loud. And I was the daughter who listened too much. After the funeral, the office changed overnight. Liam moved into our father's corner suite, the skyline bending to his reflection. I stayed in my smaller office down the hall, surrounded by stacks of design drafts and glass that looked out over a city that had stopped feeling like home. That's when I met him. Julian Price. He was my father's former advisor, a man who carried the kind of charm that made people trust him before they even knew why. Elegant, silver-haired, with eyes that read you like fine print. He'd been my quiet advocate when I interned years ago. He once told me, "You have your father's precision, Celeste, but your mother's instinct. That's a dangerous combination in the right hands." Back then, I thought he meant it as a compliment. After my father passed, Julian became my mentor, or at least, that's what I believed. He told me to focus on my creative strengths, to channel my grief into design. "Let Liam handle the numbers," he said, "you bring the soul." And I did. For months, I worked late into the night, sketching plans for Astra Heights, an urban renewal project built around light, sustainability, and public art. It wasn't just architecture. It was philosophy. The kind of vision that would have made my father proud. Julian would stop by in the evenings, a coffee in hand, his tone patient, guiding, almost fatherly. He said the board wasn't ready yet, that we should perfect every detail first. He said timing was everything. He said trust him. And I did. It wasn't until much later, after the board presentation, after the press conference, after I watched Julian and Liam standing side by side in front of cameras unveiling my designs as their own, that I understood the danger in mistaking guidance for loyalty. The betrayal didn't feel like a knife. It felt like air being stolen. I remember sitting at my desk that night, the city lights blurring through my tears, every part of me hollow except for one small, quiet ember. I thought about my father. About the way he used to pause before signing a deal, as if he was waiting for silence to confirm it. I thought about the way he'd looked at me the day I showed him my first design, proud, but cautious, as though love and business were threads that shouldn't tangle. And I thought, if this was the inheritance I'd been given, invisibility, manipulation, silence, then I would learn how to make it mine. The next morning, my name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the company announcement. Ward Holdings unveils Astra Heights, a vision for the future, led by Liam Ward and senior advisor Julian Price. There it was, in glossy black print, under the company's signature gold seal. My sketches had been redrawn, my words rewritten. Even my concept pitch, "A city that breathes," had been reshaped into a tagline for a campaign I'd never approved. When I walked into the office, applause echoed down the hall. People congratulated Julian and Liam, eyes bright with ambition. I smiled as they passed, invisible in plain sight, a ghost watching her own dream parade by. Julian approached me in the corridor, his expression warm but rehearsed. "I know it hurts," he said softly. "But this is how legacy works, Celeste. Sometimes credit has to serve the greater vision." I remember the smell of his cologne, cedarwood and arrogance. And for the first time, I realized that his mentorship had never been about guidance. It had been containment. For weeks, I said nothing. I played my role, dutiful, polite, showing up at meetings where they discussed Astra Heights like it was a trophy. Liam thrived in the attention, Julian bathed in the praise. And I? I learned. I watched how they spoke to investors, how they spun half-truths into gold. I learned how power was shaped, not by those who shouted, but by those who controlled the silence around them. At night, I went home and redrew everything. New plans. New concepts. Different foundations, different geometry. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I was designing not for them, but for me. It was during one of those late nights that I found the box, the one that would change everything. A knock at the door. A courier. "Delivery for Ms. Ward," he said, setting down a weathered parcel wrapped in brown paper. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but the initials etched faintly across the seal stopped my breath. R.W. Inside were my father's watch, a silver pen, and a leather notebook bound with an elastic strap. It smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar, his scent. I opened it carefully, afraid the air might erase it. The first page was blank. The second was full of notes, sketches, half-thoughts in his familiar slanted handwriting. Then I saw it, my own name written at the top of a page. Celeste's concept, Astra Heights. Brilliant potential. She sees what I don't. Keep this safe. I sat there in the half-light, the city beyond my window humming like a pulse, and for the first time since his death, I felt seen. Truly, deeply seen. I stayed awake until dawn, reading every word, tracing his thoughts. He'd been refining my ideas in private, protecting them, shaping them. He must have known Liam and Julian would dismiss me. He must have known I'd need proof one day. That morning, when I looked in the mirror, I saw something new in my reflection, not grief, not defeat, but a quiet resolve. The next time I stepped into Ward Holdings, I was no longer the silent daughter. I was the storm they didn't see coming. I started small. I began requesting meetings with departments no one thought I cared about: acquisitions, sustainability, legal. I listened, took notes, memorized every weakness in the system. Julian noticed, of course. He cornered me after one meeting, his smile practiced. "You're spreading yourself thin, Celeste," he said. "Don't waste energy on details that don't concern you." But they did concern me. Because details were where empires cracked. And the cracks in Ward Holdings were already showing. Liam's leadership was erratic. He loved publicity but ignored budgets. Projects stalled. Investors whispered. My mother, once the elegant hostess of family dinners, started avoiding calls from journalists. I watched it all with detached precision, as if studying a building I once admired but knew was structurally unsound. Then came the gala. It was a celebration of the company's ongoing success. The ballroom glittered under chandeliers, the air thick with perfume and ego. I wore a dark emerald gown and a calm expression, watching my brother bask under the lights, shaking hands with men who only smiled for the cameras. Julian approached me with a glass of champagne. "To family," he said smoothly, his eyes unreadable. I raised my glass. "To truth," I replied. He laughed, but there was a flicker of unease. A man like him understood that sometimes the quietest toast carried the loudest warning. Later that night, I slipped away to the balcony overlooking the city, my father's city, and took out his notebook from my clutch. I ran my fingers over his handwriting under the moonlight and whispered, "I'm not done yet." And I meant it. Because legacies don't just crumble. They transform, one quiet, relentless decision at a time. I began to notice who watched and who whispered. In the office, loyalties were fluid, as slippery as champagne poured down crystal flutes. People pretended not to see the fractures, but they could feel them. Ward Holdings was beginning to tremble, just enough to make ambitious hearts restless. And I understood something my father once said to me when I was 16: a structure doesn't collapse because of force celeste. It collapses because someone stops believing it will stand. So I gave people reasons to stop believing. Small things at first, questions at meetings that revealed inconsistencies. Proposals that quietly redirected attention to neglected projects. Memos that cited my father's forgotten directives. Nothing overtly rebellious. Just enough to remind the room that I was listening. Soon the interns were whispering again. "She's back," one of them said. "She never left," another replied. I made allies where no one thought to look: the administrative assistant who managed Julian's calendar, the accountant who quietly corrected Liam's impulsive expenses, the IT tech who handled archived communications. Each of them had seen too much, been ignored too long. And in me, they saw not rebellion but recognition. One evening, as I sat reviewing blueprints in the dim office, I heard footsteps. It was Maya, the head of accounting, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes softened by exhaustion. She hesitated at my door. "You should know," she said quietly, "Julian's been moving funds. Personal accounts tied to the Astra Heights contracts. Offshore." I looked up slowly. "Do you have proof?" She nodded once. Enough to make him disappear. It was then that I felt the first spark of true power, not from revenge, but from the weight of truth aligning itself in my hands. I spent the next weeks building a case. Quietly. Methodically. Every late night in that office became a ritual: the hum of the city outside, the low glow of my desk lamp, the whisper of paper. My father's watch lay beside me, ticking softly, as if keeping time with my pulse. When I was ready, I called an emergency board meeting. The glass conference room at Ward Holdings had always felt like a stage, polished, reflective, merciless under bright light. I sat at one end, Julian at the other, Liam lounging with his usual practiced indifference. The board members filled the seats, expectant, curious. Julian opened with his trademark charm. "Before we begin, I just want to commend everyone for their commitment to our vision," I interrupted him. Calmly. "There's a discrepancy in our project funding," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "It's tied to Astra Heights." The air shifted. Liam frowned. "What kind of discrepancy?" "$6 million in unreported transfers," I replied. "All routed through Julian's consulting firms." Julian's face didn't move, but his knuckles tightened around his pen. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have evidence?" I smiled faintly. "I do. And so does the company's financial department." Maya verified every transaction. For the first time, his confidence cracked. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw not the grieving daughter, not the quiet shadow in her father's legacy. He saw the architect of his undoing. Liam pushed back from his chair, anger flickering in his eyes. "You can't just ambush us like this, Celeste." "Ambush?" I said softly. "No, brother. This is exposure." The board fell silent. It was one of those rare moments when sound itself seems to hold its breath. Julian tried to recover, words tumbling in smooth rehearsed tones about misunderstandings and operational errors, but the room had already turned. They could smell blood. Afterward, as the meeting dissolved into chaos, I gathered my papers and walked out without another word. I could feel eyes following me, some in awe, others in fear. The marble hallway stretched ahead like a cathedral, my heels echoing in steady rhythm. It felt like walking through fire and ice all at once. That night, I didn't go home. I went to the penthouse my father once used for private retreats, a place untouched since his passing. Dust lay like memory across the mahogany surfaces. His books lined the shelves, his decanter still half full. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the skyline blaze in the dark. Julian's downfall had begun, but I wasn't satisfied. Not yet. Because as the dust began to settle, I realized Liam still believed himself untouchable. He thought I had simply lashed out in grief. He thought I'd fall silent again once the noise faded. He didn't understand that grief doesn't end. It transforms. In the days that followed, I started reconstructing my father's original vision, the projects that had been dismissed, the innovations buried under corporate politics. My plan wasn't just to expose the rot. It was to rebuild the foundation in my own name. But power attracts predators. And as I stepped closer to reclaiming what was mine, I discovered that betrayal had more layers than I'd imagined. Because someone I trusted, someone I'd begun to believe in, was already planning my next fall. I learned that power doesn't vanish when the meeting ends. It lingers, in whispers, in signatures, in the way people start watching the floor when you walk past. After Julian's suspension, Ward Holdings moved into damage control. Investors wanted answers, employees wanted reassurance, and my mother. She wanted quiet. "Don't stir more conflict," she pleaded over dinner, her voice trembling beneath practiced grace. "Your father wouldn't have wanted this." I looked at her, immaculate as ever, pearls at her throat, eyes clouded with exhaustion. "He wanted truth," I said softly. "And that's all I'm doing." But truth, I was learning, has a strange appetite. It doesn't stop when you feed it once. It keeps consuming. My next step was rebuilding. I reached out to new investors, proposed restructuring teams, and personally oversaw the restoration of smaller urban projects, the ones my father had called the heartbeat of the city. And that's when I met Noah. He was brought in as a senior consultant, sharp, confident, and unnervingly perceptive. The board claimed he'd been hired to stabilize investor relations. I suspected he was there to watch me. Still, he had a mind for detail and an ease with people I envied. He asked the right questions. He listened without interrupting. "You've got fire, Celeste," he said one evening as we walked through the glass atrium. "But be careful not to burn the whole house down before you build your own." I should have recognized the warning for what it was, not concern, but reconnaissance. Over the next few months, he became a confidant. We discussed strategy, market trends, even my late father's journal. He'd lean across the table, eyes steady, saying things like, "He'd be proud of how you're handling this." And maybe, in some fragile way, I believed him. Because I wanted someone to believe in me, not the scandal. Not the inheritance. Just me. Then came the second betrayal. It was subtle, like a faint shift in the temperature of the room. Documents I hadn't approved were suddenly circulating. Internal memos bore my digital signature. Project plans were altered, budgets inflated, contracts reassigned. And when the board called me in, the evidence was damning. Julian had returned quietly to the background, whispering poison into ears now eager to hear it. Liam, once embarrassed, was now hungry for redemption. And Noah, my supposed ally, stood beside them with a look that was neither guilt nor pride. Just inevitability. "You've overstepped, Celeste," Liam said, his tone rehearsed. "These allocations are irregular." "I didn't sign those," I said evenly. Julian smirked. "That's unfortunate, considering your authorization appears here, here, and here." He slid a folder toward me. Each page bore my forged signature, flawless. Noah avoided my eyes. His silence told me everything. I felt the heat rise behind my ribs, not rage, but a kind of crystalline stillness, the kind that arrives when there's nothing left to lose but your own restraint. "I understand," I said quietly, closing the folder. "You've made your decision." Liam leaned forward. "You're suspended pending review. It's for your own good, Celeste." My own good. The phrase echoed in my head like a broken bell as I walked out of that boardroom for the last time. Outside, the city roared beneath the skyline, taxis, sirens, life moving forward as if nothing had happened. I stood on the pavement, the glass tower looming behind me like a monument to every betrayal I'd endured. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply exhaled. Because they thought they had stripped me of power. But power had already changed hands. Before Noah had turned, I had shared with him select information, fragments of my plans, yes, but also decoys. I had mirrored my father's old tactic, build trust with illusion. And while they chased shadows, I had quietly established something far more real. An independent firm, Solstice Design Group. Registered under a subsidiary name, staffed by a handful of the same people Ward Holdings had overlooked. People who were loyal, not to the Ward empire, but to me. Maya was there. So was the IT tech, the administrative assistant, and 2 young architects who still believed in the city's potential. We worked in a repurposed studio space downtown, sunlight pouring through tall industrial windows. It wasn't glamorous, but it was alive, filled with the hum of new beginnings. Our first project came from an investor who'd quietly cut ties with Ward Holdings after the scandal. He wanted something fresh. Ethical. Visionary. I called it Astra Reborn. And this time, there was no one left to take it from me. Still, at night, I couldn't stop thinking about Noah. About the quiet betrayal. About the small, painful truth that even strength doesn't erase, the ache of misplaced trust. Then one evening, he called. Celeste, his voice said over the line, low and careful. They're turning on each other. Liam and Julian. I thought you should know. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I was wrong, he said. And because you're about to win. The line went dead. I stared out the window at the city's reflection shimmering in the glass, the same skyline my father once built, now fractured between greed and renewal. And for the first time, I felt not anger, but purpose. Because what they had done was unforgivable, but what I would do next would be unforgettable. I wasn't just going to reclaim the company. I was going to redefine what it meant to inherit power. Not by name. By creation. People think victory begins with a grand entrance. It doesn't. It begins in silence. In long nights at an empty desk, the sound of a pen scratching across plans that no one will see for months. In the space between defeat and resolve, where anger becomes architecture. That's where I lived for almost a year. Solstice Design Group grew faster than I'd imagined. We started with one project, Astra Reborn, a sustainable housing complex in the city's forgotten district. By the time the foundation was laid, 2 more investors had found us. Within 6 months, our name appeared in design journals beside words like revival, visionary, integrity. And Ward Holdings? They floundered. Julian's offshore dealings had sparked investigations, and Liam's charm couldn't cover the cracks. Lawsuits piled up. Developers withdrew. My mother's name appeared in tabloids, pity wrapped in perfume. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt distance, like watching a storm roll away after it's already destroyed your home. Still, I worked. Tirelessly. Our office wasn't grand, exposed brick, tall windows, and the faint smell of coffee and fresh ink. But it was alive with purpose. People laughed there. They believed. Sometimes, when the city quieted, I'd find myself at the drafting table again, tracing lines under the soft glow of my father's old lamp. His watch still ticked beside me, keeping time as though he never left. And then came the letter. It arrived in a thick ivory envelope bearing the Ward Holdings crest. Inside, an invitation to the annual Founders Gala, the same event where they had once toasted my father's name, then buried his daughter's. I almost threw it away. Almost. But then I thought of my father's handwriting in that notebook. Keep this safe. He hadn't meant just the designs. He meant our name. So I went. The gala was held at the same glass ballroom, glittering chandeliers, gold-dusted champagne, and music soft enough to hide whispered politics. Cameras flashed as Liam and Julian made their entrance, smiles polished to perfection. Then the announcer's voice echoed, "Please welcome Celeste Ward, founder and director of Solstice Design Group." The room turned. I walked in wearing black silk that moved like smoke, simple jewelry, confidence for armor. Conversations faltered. Champagne paused midair. Liam's expression flickered, surprise, then irritation. Julian's smile was a mask of control, stretched thin. "Celeste," he said as I approached. "How unexpected." "Is it?" I replied. "I'm still a shareholder. Legally, still family." He chuckled softly. "Always dramatic. Always underestimated," I corrected. The photographer caught that moment, my calm defiance beside his brittle charm. That photo would later circle the business magazines under the headline, "The Ward Legacy, a Family Divided by Design." Later that evening, when the speeches began, I listened from the edge of the room. Liam stood at the podium, his voice full of the same hollow confidence that had carried him through every lie. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not just our history, but our endurance." Ward Holdings stands as a symbol of integrity. I almost laughed. But I didn't. Instead, I reached into my clutch and sent a single message, one I'd been waiting months to release. At that moment, a live feed appeared on the ballroom's projection screens. Not photos. Not rumors. Documents. Emails. Contracts. Offshore transfers. Julian's hidden dealings. Liam's falsified reports. Even Noah's old communications, revealing his involvement before his sudden resignation. Gasps filled the room. A journalist stood. Cameras snapped. Liam froze mid-sentence, his face drained of color. Julian's glass shattered against the floor. And I? I simply stood there, watching the truth I'd built in silence finally roar into light. Security scrambled. Voices rose. The Ward crest flickered on the screens like a crown set aflame. I turned to leave. "Celeste." Liam's voice cracked through the chaos. "You did this?" I paused by the doors, looking back at him over my shoulder. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I just stopped protecting what was already collapsing." And then I walked out, into the cool night, where the city air smelled like rain and redemption. That moment became legend. Within weeks, Ward Holdings' stock plummeted. Julian resigned for health reasons. Liam tried to salvage the brand, but investors fled. Investigations followed. And Solstice rose in their place, the phoenix built from their ashes. Our projects expanded across the skyline, glass and steel shaped like hope, not greed. People said I'd inherited my father's genius. They were wrong. I inherited his restraint. But the victory wasn't all triumph. Success doesn't heal loss, it simply gives it meaning. I kept the penthouse as my home base, but I rarely slept there. The silence was heavy, filled with echoes of my father's voice and the ticking of that old watch. Sometimes I'd pour a drink and whisper, "We did it, Dad," half expecting to hear his answer in the hum of the city below. Months later, as awards and interviews flooded in, I received a call from an unknown number. "Celeste Ward?" A woman's voice said. "This is Diane from the National Urban Foundation. Your father once proposed a partnership with us. His proposal was never completed. Would you consider finishing it?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Yes," I said finally. "Send me everything." When the documents arrived, I recognized his handwriting in the margins, faded but deliberate. For the city, and for her. I smiled through tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. So I finished it. The Ward Initiative launched that fall, a public-private effort to rebuild underserved districts, to create spaces that honored legacy, not ego. At the ribbon cutting, I spoke to a crowd that filled the square. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. But my words weren't for them. "They say legacy is what we leave behind," I said. "But I think it's who we choose to become when everything else is taken away." The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. My eyes were on the horizon, where sunlight gleamed on the glass towers my father built, now reflected beside the ones I had created. That night, I walked home through the streets, the air crisp and electric. I passed a bakery still open, laughter spilling from its windows, and thought of the girl I'd once been, silent, invisible, mourning. And I smiled. Because somewhere between loss and justice, I had found something rarer than victory. Peace. Not the fragile kind that trembles before the next storm, but the kind that stands tall amid its ruins, unbreakable. I looked up at the skyline, whispered one last word into the wind, and turned toward home. Rebuilt.